Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of King of Commercial Real Estate. And we have the king, as always, Dolf de Roos. Thank you for coming today.
Hey, Majorie.
And today we're going to talk about renovations in commercial real estate. So, first of all, what are commercial renovations?
Well, I think what you're saying is where we do something to the building to increase its appeal either to the existing tenant or more likely to a potential tenant.
And in the case of these renovations, I know that there are ways for either the tenant to come up with the funds and do these renovations, or the owner himself for the property. When does the situation apply? When does the property owner is the one that does all the payments for the renovations?
Well, it depends in large part to where we are in the economic cycle. So when there is a shortage of tenants and when many buildings are vacant, then often a tenant will look and say, well, I like this premise, I like the location, I like the car parking here. However, the carpet's worn out, the windows are horrible, and the lighting is still old, incandescent or fluorescent tubes. We want you, the landlord, to spend a ton of money doing it up, and then we'll consider taking on a lease. So when there's a shortage of tenants, that's how it happens. When there is a shortage of space, when tenants are vying for it, they might look at the property and say, okay, we'll do all these renovations, we'll replace the carpet and the lights and everything else. Would you give us a bit of a break? And the landlord might say, no, I've got 10 people willing to take on these premises without doing any work, so take it or leave it. So it depends on supply and demand, like anything out there. But there are certain norms, like sometimes there is what's called TIs or tenant improvement allowance, which is where the landlord says, all right, we will forego rent for 3 months or we'll give you a $20,000 allowance to renovate this property. I've got a number of tenants who are themselves, architectural design firms or companies that do renovations in homes or office buildings. And so they often want to do the work themselves and they ask for a break. Can we have, no rent for the next 3 years or something? And I'll say no, but how about for the next 2 months or something like that? It's all by negotiation.
Gotcha. And in the case of all of these tenants, the ones that are requesting the landlord to do the renovations, is there any way for the landlord to come up with the funds without having to coming up with them from his pocket? I mean, is there any way to finance it?
Well, here's the interesting thing, and it's an interesting distinction between commercial and residential. Because firstly, I've never had a residential tenant who says, you know what, I need an extra bedroom. Do you mind if I spend money to build an extra bedroom? Whereas when it comes to commercial, in most commercial lease contracts, there is a clause that says prior to making any improvements or renovations, the tenant must seek permission from the landlord. It's worded slightly differently, but that's basically what it boils down to. So often, because they earn their income on their premises, because they might have a car yard or a laundromat facility and they want to make it better, more efficient, smoother, they will often call you or write you and say, listen, we're thinking of sealing all the gravel into a bitumen car park, or we're thinking of doing this or that. Do we have your permission? And in general, as long as tenants are willing to spend big dollops of money on my property and they can't take those renovations with them when their lease expires, I say yes.
By all means, yeah.
Of
I mean,
course.
if anything, it increases the values proper.
Right. Well, it
the property's
usually
value.
does increase the value. But occasionally they'll say, okay, I want to make this improvement, but I don't have the money to do it. Will you pay for it? And most commercial lease documents, Majorie, have a clause that says if the landlord agrees to making improvements at the tenant's request, then the tenant agrees to pay X% of the cost of the improvements in the form of extra rent. So let me give you an example. I had a commercial shop. It was a 24-hour convenience store. And the tenant called me and said, listen, there's only a small window out front and a door, and it's not lit well at night. I think it would look better if I tore the entire front of the building down. I said, well, so far I don't like the idea. And he said, and then replace it with what's called a glass curtain. So make the entire front out of glass so that people can see in, and at night it's all lit up, and it might make them think, oh, yes, we need to get milk or bread or whatever. So they stop there. It would increase business. And I said, okay, well, if you're seeking my permission to do that, absolutely go ahead. I think it'd be a great idea. I knew it would increase the value of the building, right?
That's right.
But then they dropped the bombshell. Well, it seems as a bombshell maybe to listeners, but for me it wasn't. They said, would you mind paying for it? And I said, well, how much is it? And it was $100,000. And Majorie, I don't know what your initial reaction is, but a tenant's asking you to pay $100,000?
That is too much. How did you come up with the funds for that?
Well, I said, of course I would. I'd be happy to pay. Why? Because the clause in the lease said that he would pay, I think it was an extra 6% in rent on that, and my mortgage interest was below that, so about 4%. So by spending 100,000, I would get an extra 6% rent. So 6,000 a year, that's a 6% return. That's not bad. However, I also knew that I could get a new appraisal or valuation done and go back to the bank. And once you spend $100,000 on doing something, the value usually goes up by more than what you spend. That's why I've got a book, longest title on Amazon. It's called 101 Ways to Massively Increase the Value of Your Real Estate Without Spending Much Money. So 100,000, not much money. The value with the appraisal, it went up by 200,000.
Oh,
So
wow.
I went to the bank and said, Mr. Bank Manager, I've got a new appraisal here. I made some improvements. I put in a new wall, and the value's gone up by 200,000. Will you lend me some money against this increased value? And being a conservative bank, he said, well, we're conservative. We'll only lend you 50%. So, Majorie, the 50% they lend me
That's your
was
100,000.
the 100,000 that I spent. And my rate that I had to pay the bank was 4%. So I was collecting 6%. I was paying 4%. I had a profit of 2,000. So here's the choice I had. I could either pay for the 100,000 myself and get a 6% return, which isn't bad, 6,000 extra a year on a 100,000 investment, or I could put no money into the deal. Yes, spend the money to do it, but borrow the money from the bank. So no money in the deal and get the margin of 2%, make $2,000 a year on none of my own money. And I opted for the latter. So this is one of those things where the tenants ask me to make an improvement and it's worth my while doing so. It created $2,000 a year out of thin air for me. Plus, think about it. My collateral went up, my equity went up, my rent went up, the value of the building went up, and most importantly of all, my tenant appreciation went up.
Which is amazing because then again, when you are in the commercial real estate business, it's your tenant, the one that is providing all of this income to come to you. So
Right.
the better relationship that you have with your tenant, the more time that he's going to try to stay, and also the more security that you as an investor would have.
Well, I can imagine the tenant saying to his friends, oh my gosh, if ever you're going to rent some commercial space, rent from Dolf. I asked him to spend $100,000 on my building and he didn't flinch. It didn't seem to bother him. He said, yes, okay.
That's right. You definitely get to have the love of your tenants for sure. Now, when it comes to renovations, though, if you're looking for a certain property, how do you know if the renovations are worth doing on that property before you even buy that deal? Because sometimes beginning investors, they can literally invest so much money on just trying to make the building look right. How do you know how much money is too much on renovations?
I never try to make a building look right because my perception of what looks right could be completely different from anyone else's perception. I don't think that's the right problem that we're solving. And commercial real estate is all about solving problems, creative problem-solving tactics, because if you can solve a problem, then you've got a tenant who's willing to pay you revenue. So let me give you another example, Majorie. You and I, say, own a warehouse, and it's particularly ugly.
Ooh.
And it's available for rent because it's vacant in a sea of similarly vacant and ugly warehouses. That's the problem. There are 15 warehouses. We're smack in the middle. They're all equally ugly and cold and horrible and disgusting looking. How would we get a tenant? So I'm not looking at, should I renovate this building to make it look good, and if so, to what standard? I'm going to be more strategic. I'm going to say, okay, for us to rent out our ugly warehouse, whom are we going to have to appeal to? Is it going to be the CEO of the company that's going to rent it with a head office in New York or Paris or London or something? No. Is it going to be the coffee or tea man or woman who's going to make the tea? No. It's going to be the manager who's going to manage that warehouse. So what do we want to do? We want to make that building as appealing as possible to the manager. So what should we renovate on this building? Well, how about the manager's office? Let's replace the linoleum floor with commercial-grade carpets. Let's replace the old locks with electronic locks so that he can never lose his keys. Let's replace the old fluorescent bulbs or incandescent bulbs with LED lighting. Let's put a 60 or 80-inch LCD screen in there and tell him it's good for corporate training videos, and we all know he's not going to watch corporate training videos there, but we've given him a line that he can use to explain why he rented our building and not the ugly one next door. We're going to put in a coffee machine so that in case they like coffee, they walk in, they'll smell the coffee and they think, yes, I like it. We'll put in a little bar fridge there to keep the end of week celebratory drinks cold. I think you get the picture. Replace the single pane windows with dual or even triple pane windows to keep the cold of winter out or the heat of summer and all the noise from the industrial area. Put in contemporary furniture or classical furniture or whatever. We don't need to spend more than $10,000, Marjorie. And now this warehouse manager who's already looked at 6 equally ugly warehouses so far that morning, he comes to our ugly one and he opens the door to the manager's office and he peeks inside, and whether he likes it or not, whether you like it or not, whether our listeners like it or not, subconsciously he's going to think, holy smoke, if I choose to lease this building, this is where I'll be spending 8 hours a day for Lord knows how many years into the future. I like it. I want it. He says, we'll take it. And he hasn't even asked what the rent is.
Exactly, because at that point, you decided to focus on your tenant, which in this case would be the manager,
The
who's
decision
going to
maker.
be
Yeah.
living there.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So we're appealing to the task at hand. And is this bribery and corruption, by the way?
No.
I don't think so. I think it's just a fair market forces. No one else has the foresight or the enthusiasm or the gumption or the temerity or the guts or the courage to go out and make those renovations. Because what if we spend $10,000 and we don't get a tenant? Then we're in a deeper hole. Whereas I'm saying, no, we'll get the tenant, all right.
That's right, because in this case, you are actually spending those extra 10,000 in this case on what truly matters on that building. Because it doesn't matter if you put like a golden bathroom, they're not going
Right.
to care.
They
But
don't
like
care.
if you do spend those 10,000 into the office manager's place,
Right.
that's definitely going to increase the amount of tenants that you're going to be getting.
Right.
So it's pretty much about a strategy at this point.
It's all
where you do
strategic. Yeah. Where do you spend the money? Where do you deploy it? Who's going to make a decision as to whether to lease these premises or not? What do we need to do to make them appealing? And the solution is different for each case. Sometimes you might need to paint the exterior of the building. If it's retail, then looks are important. If it's industrial, then they don't care.
Because, like, for example, in the case of industrial, you could just spend on, I don't know, a little bit more on the cooling system, for example, if it were to be a
Exactly.
warehouse kind of
Or
thing.
putting in a double-sized garage door so that they can have containers delivered there.
And the trucks and everything.
Yeah, exactly. It just depends on what it's likely to be used for.
So it all comes down to renovations are a strategic move where you deploy your money the best way possible.
Exactly.
Thank you so much again, Dolph. And thank you to our audience. There you have it. Use your money wisely. And these renovations are worth it. They could literally include way more value into your property. We're going to see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.